Hello and welcome to the Political History of the United States. Episode 4.49, Valley Forge. As 1778 began, everybody was truly reeling from what had happened months earlier at Saratoga. As news of the French alliance reached London, the British had to take a very serious look at the ongoing war and decide exactly what they were going to do. Very quickly, the war was now not simply about reasserting their authority over some wayward colonies. Instead, it became about maintaining that hard-won power and influence from the 7 Years' War. Really, we know that the entrance of France meant that the American colonies were no longer the primary concern for the British. So by the time that 1778 begins, the British were making overtures towards the Americans with offers of what amounted to home rule, which gave them absolutely everything they were asking for, with the notable exception of independence. The victory over Burgoyne had indeed changed the outlook of the war. Although Washington was relieved to hear of a potential French alliance, and certainly everybody was flying high heading into the year. That is not to say that the American situation was exactly settled. The war was still going on, and now the Americans found themselves fighting a different enemy, the elements, as they endured an absolutely brutal winter outside of Philadelphia at Valley Forge. This week, I want to spend our time looking at that winter of 1778 and following the preparations for both the Americans and the British as they moved towards that year's campaigns. To say that the winter of 1778 at Valley Forge was brutal would be an understatement. It is no accident that Valley Forge is ingrained in the American psyche and has become something of an archetype for the suffering of the American soldiers during the Revolution. Valley Forge was not exactly an ideal location for winter quarters. It was remote and left much to be desired when it came to the availability of either buildings to use as barracks or, critically, food and forage. What it did provide was an elevated position that was relatively safe from attack, and was located close enough to Philadelphia that Washington could keep his eye on Howe and the British. The most immediate problem for the Americans is that Valley Forge lacked in buildings, meaning that the men would have to quickly construct their own. These were truly Spartan structures. Constructed of logs, these were hastily built, cramped accommodations. The Americans lacked material, such as straw, to make beds, with most people just being forced to sleep on the floor. More than the uncomfortable living conditions, the men were also dealing with an acute food shortage. There was no meat to eat, and the most popular dish were these little flour and water cakes known as fire cakes. By the middle of February, Washington was using distressing terms to describe his men, such as starving and famine. Part of the problem is that Washington recognized the power of public relations, and therefore was hesitant to take more dramatic options, such as seizing the food outright. Instead, Washington would send commissaries, who were working for the Department of the Army. These men were in charge of finding food for the troops, and they were sent out to the neighboring states to attempt to purchase said food, or at the very least, take the food and supplies with the promise of future payment. This is an important distinction when we compare it to what we know about the British, and it really helps to illustrate just how both sides viewed the war. Washington was making a sacrifice here, in that he made it much more difficult on himself to feed his own army. There is no question that him just taking the food and supplies that he needed would have made his life much easier. What Washington understood, however, is that the last thing that he could afford to do was to turn the people against the Continental Army by stealing from them. The British, on the other hand, had long done much to alienate the local populace, including the Loyalists. Recall that terror that the Americans felt at the mere suggestion of the British getting local native tribes to raid along the frontiers. The British, who especially in the South, were depending on Loyalist assistance, did little to ingratiate themselves amongst that population. Think back for a moment to their withdrawal through New Jersey during late 1776 and into early 1777. Here we saw the British often failing to protect the Loyalists, whose support they depended upon. Compare this to Washington, who took enough precautions that, at a minimum, he was not proving overly burdensome to the local population, and was at least pretending to offer compensation for the goods that he had taken. This sense of tone deafness on the part of the British would be illustrated in other ways as well. A good example of this came when it was time for William Howe to pack his bags and head back to England. When Howe requested to return home in early 1778, the North Ministry was more than happy to oblige, in order to remove the now much maligned Howe. In his place, Henry Clinton would become the commanding officer in North America. Now, we are going to talk much more in depth about this in a few moments. However, for right now, I want to skip ahead and consider Howe's actions as he left North America. If Howe had decided to quietly slip out of the colonies with minimal fanfare, his exit would have still been celebrated by the Americans. However, it would never have been much more than that. William Howe instead decided that a quiet exit, well, that was not for him. He wanted a little bit of fanfare. During the middle of May, just days after the news of the French alliance had reached Washington, Howe was treated to an extravagant exit party. There were parades, bands played music, and there was a complicated production, put together by Major John Andre, that went so far as to feature mock jousts and knights. It was seriously over the top. Now, unsurprisingly, the American press absolutely panned the celebration. However, even the Loyalists cringed at the amount of excess and found themselves embarrassed by the British actions. Battles of public relations aside, Washington's army found itself in a rough spot. They were lacking food, clothing, and generally the basic necessities. Congress, as we will discuss more here shortly, worked at such a glacial pace that their own effectiveness was often compromised. The army was desperate for food and did not have the time for things to slowly wind their way through committees. Although Washington did send out those commissaries in search of food, he suffered from the dual problem of not having the horses and wagons necessary to transport it back to Valley Forge, as well as the problem that people were choosing to sell to the British instead, as they were able to pay in actual cash instead of promises of future compensation. Congress did make some attempts to reform the commissary department. However, these changes caused more problems than they did solutions. Following the resignation of Joseph Trumbull, the brother of famed artist John Trumbull, who headed up the commissary department, Congress took on many of the duties themselves. Unfortunately, many of the deputies that they appointed to the position used their power for personal enrichment, often to the very serious detriment of the troops. The good news here is that Congress very quickly figured out that they were, in fact, pretty bad at this job, and yet again chose to reorganize the department just a few months later. The new system, under the direction of Jeremiah Wadsworth, returned power to the Department of the Army and cooked in an incentive-based system that rewarded good work by giving a percentage of what they brought into the Army. If somebody supplied more food, they were going to enjoy the benefit of some extra cash in their own pocket. Although this did not stop unscrupulous profiteering completely, it did provide incentives and opportunities for self-enrichment that would not come at the expense of the Army. Nathaniel Greene was named the new American quartermaster and was in charge of ensuring that there were enough supplies for the Army. These supplies included livestock and horses. As had been the case with the commissaries, Greene found that people were reluctant to play along in exchange for promises of future pay. However, despite this continued reluctance, by the spring of 1778, things were getting noticeably better. At a minimum, the risk of a famine had subsided, and more food did begin to flow into the camp. Likewise, basic items such as clothing became more available than they had before. I bring this up because it tells us many things about the American situation at the start of 1778. Although the Americans were at a high point in terms of success in the field, they were still very much an army that had to figure out on the fly how to survive. Although they knew the basics, like having a commissary and the quartermaster's department, actually setting up the bureaucratic groundwork for such a system was a completely different challenge. It likewise reminds us that there were plenty of people out there willing to work for the British, whether it be for actual loyalty or in the pursuit of making a quick buck. The British had made mistakes in their dealings with the Loyalists. However, that did not change the fact that the Loyalists still existed. These were not the only changes to come to the American Army during the first half of 1778. All throughout the Army's organizational structure, Congress was attempting reform. The Corps of Engineers was officially instituted. Dragoons were introduced to the Army, and the Artillery Corps was consolidated into the Artillery Artificer Regiment. Congress likewise understood the importance of maintaining its officers. A difficult task considering that Congress was not exactly rolling in money to pay them. The officers were very much demanding their pay, something that Congress could not always afford to provide. If the officers were to resign as a result, it would leave the Army with a dangerous lack of senior leadership. The solution to this problem became known as the half-pay compromise. In what acted as a pension, it promised half pay for life to any officer who served for the entire war. With the officers, at least temporarily, satisfied with the compromise, Congress urged, though critically did not demand, for reasons we will talk about momentarily, that the states needed to raise more men for the Army, and that conscription should be used if necessary to achieve that end. Finally, understanding the considerable frustrations of George Washington, they mandated that unless there was an exceptional situation, there should be no more foreign-born officers. Washington had lamented this problem for a while now, most recently with the arrival of Lafayette, although in that case he would quickly come around. Washington had all of the leadership that he needed, and was aggravated at the foreign-born officers coming in and blocking potential promotion of the American-born officers. This is not to say that Washington did not find some of these men to be very useful and valuable officers, most notably the aforementioned Lafayette and the Polish-born Casimir Pulaski, who would be invaluable in the creation of the American cavalry. However, before this prohibition was passed, there was one more critical foreign officer who has still yet to make his debut. Although there were very real hardships during the winter of 1778, Washington did not leave his men just sitting idle. During that miserable winter, a Prussian soldier named Frederick Wilhelm Augustus Henry Ferdinand Baron von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge. Von Steuben proved impressively apt at inflating his own resume. Von Steuben portrayed himself as a high-ranking military official who had served in the Prussian army under Frederick the Great. He was a lieutenant general and an aide-de-camp to Frederick, plus was a baron with a large estate. There was one slight problem, however. Although he did fight in the Prussian army as a commissioned officer, that was as close to Frederick as he ever got. Also, although he had some claim to that baron title, there was no estate. You see, some years before, von Steuben had been introduced to the French Minister of War, Saint-Germain. Von Steuben was looking for work, and for a professional soldier, that was a difficult feat while peace prevailed in Europe. Saint-Germain recognized that a Prussian officer could provide considerable support to the Americans, and introduced him to Benjamin Franklin. Von Steuben was initially hesitant to get involved in the American War, largely because Franklin initially balked at paying his travel expenses to America, having his own hands tied from giving what amounted to a cash advance. Von Steuben was insulted and went to return to Prussia to continue to look for work. However, it was exactly at this moment that the wheels came off for the Baron, when an accusation of homosexuality was levied against him. This was an extremely serious accusation, and it caused those who had been close with him to immediately distance themselves. At right around the same time, Beaumarchais and Saint-Germain wrote to him, asking him to come back to Paris. Considering his current prospects, it seemed like a fantastic time to get out of Dodge. Upon his return, he learned that not much had changed. The Americans were not going to cover his expenses, offer a commission, or promise anything at all. However, Beaumarchais was willing to take the risk and covered the costs to send von Steuben to Philadelphia. Historian Paul Lockhart writes in his book, The Drill Master of Valley Forge, that neither Saint-Germain nor Beaumarchais were acting out of any particular love for the Prussian. Rather, they recognized that von Steuben filled a void in the American army. The American army was notoriously undisciplined. The French desperately needed somebody to ensure that the American army did not just disintegrate before the French could join the war. They believed that von Steuben could help instill some of that famous Prussian discipline into the American army, something that they were seriously lacking. Lockhart goes further and states that the inflation of von Steuben's resume likely came from Beaumarchais and Saint-Germain, as well as from Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane, who all recognized the skill set that he could bring to the American cause. Satisfied, on September 26, 1777, Baron von Steuben set out for the United States. Dubious qualifications aside, von Steuben did a sufficient job of impressing people once he arrived in the United States, and would reach Valley Forge in February. Washington was impressed upon meeting von Steuben, and agreed that the troops could use the potential infusion of professionalism that von Steuben sought to bring to the table. In shockingly short order, von Steuben was able to remake the army by training them in a modified version of the Prussian system. Von Steuben was able to have so much success in part because his training used a stair-step methodology. First, he trained a specifically hand-picked squad, while the rest of the company watched. Once this one squad was trained, they assisted in training the rest of the company, while the rest of the regiment watched. The program continued to expand out until the entire army was training in a far more orderly way than had ever been previously possible. In his role as what amounted essentially to the United States' first drill sergeant, von Steuben was well liked by pretty much everybody. To be sure, he was rough. He had to turn a bunch of provincial farmers into a professional army after all. However, he was also quick to praise. The men also found a great deal of amusement in the Baron's occasional profanity-laced tirades. Mind you that this was in a mixture of German and French, although the men quickly found themselves able to recognize his curses. Although he struggled with English and needed to use Hamilton and John Lawrence to translate to English for him, he did quickly pick up a new favorite phrase: "God damn." The winter at Valley Forge, for all of its hardships, saw something of a rebirth of the American army. The army still had problems and shortcomings to be sure, but what emerged on the eve of the 1778 campaign season was a revamped and, hopefully, more professional army than had existed previously. The Americans were not the only ones revamping the army heading towards the summer of 1778. As we had discussed in detail last time, the British were absolutely reeling in the wake of losing Burgoyne and his army. As more news came down that the French would be entering the war, the British were forced to contend with the fact that they were now dealing with a situation that was far grander in scope. At home in London, there was a healthy amount of finger-pointing going around, with most of those fingers now pointing squarely in the direction of William Howe. Howe, probably somewhat unfairly, took the majority of the blame in the British press for what had occurred at Saratoga. It was Burgoyne, after all, that had struck out on this ambitious plan, and had seemingly just assumed that a rendezvous with Howe was going to happen. Back in London, it was the vagueness in Germain's instructions that had left Howe pretty much free to act as he wanted. So it is not as though he had disobeyed orders or anything like that. On the other hand, when you look at the situation as a whole, it seems overwhelmingly clear that Howe should have linked up with Burgoyne. Strategically, it was always a more sound plan than taking Philadelphia, which, although symbolically important, held little strategic value. Even beyond that, Howe's conduct during the war had left the British frustrated. The war had been dragging on at a glacial pace. New York remained the only legitimately critical British holding heading into 1778, other than the recently captured Philadelphia. The war was nowhere close to an end, and as we discussed last week, people were blaming Howe's often lethargic pace for a war that seemed to be dragging on without much hope for a conclusion. Now, suddenly, the French were jumping into the fray, and all signs pointed to things dragging on even longer, and becoming far more involved than the British were hoping for. William Howe had never had an overly optimistic view of the war either. Recall that he had commented after the Battle of Bunker Hill that he thought that the British were fighting a war that they probably could not win. Prior to the war, Howe seemed to hold at least some sympathies towards the Americans, and had gotten along well with Benjamin Franklin. Well, none of this is meant to suggest that Howe was somehow just going through the motions. It does lead us to conclude that this is a cause that Howe probably did not harbor any deep convictions for. Howe had, for a while, been requesting to get recalled back to England, and following the jolt that was the loss of Burgoyne's army, the cabinet decided that it was time for his return. Henry Clinton became the new commanding officer on the ground. Lord North was pleased with the switch. Clinton had a reputation for being much more energetic than Howe. However, he also came with some baggage of his own. Clinton had a reputation for being difficult to work with, and was no stranger to creating enemies out of his friends. The British likewise found themselves in a position where they were forced to reconsider their tactics in the war thus far. The British were facing two major problems heading into the 1778 campaign season. First, their entire northern army had been lost at Saratoga. Although Howe may not have paid much attention to them, it had still been a critical component of the British war effort, and now it was gone. Causing far more of a headache is that with the French now entering into the war, the British needed to seriously consider what resources they had and what their objectives were for what was now a much larger operation. Clinton therefore walked into a situation that saw him fighting with resources that were significantly less than what Howe had at his disposal. In addition to the losses in the north, the ministry now needed to reinforce holdings that would be vulnerable to French attacks. In order to accomplish this, the ministry ordered half of the North American garrison to reinforce Florida and the Caribbean. Just like that, Clinton saw half of his army, some 8,000 men, get pulled out from under him and sent to other locations. The British ministry recognized that with his army now cut in half, Clinton could no longer hold both Philadelphia and New York, and thus ordered Clinton to withdraw from Philadelphia and move everybody back to the safety of New York. This means that going into the 1778 campaign season, the British were in the exact same place that they had been a year before. With things obviously not going well, the British decided that it was time to change their focus. With the abandonment of Philadelphia, the middle colonies were clearly no longer the target. Plus, nobody was really itching to head north and have a replay of Burgoyne's march to isolate New England. The British target, therefore, would shift to the south. The wider war, and we are talking about the coming battles down in the Caribbean with the French, would now largely shift to a naval engagement, playing to the greatest strengths of the British. In North America proper, Clinton would now focus his attack on Georgia and the Carolinas. There were certain advantages to moving the war to the South. The British believed that resolve in the South was far less than with their northern counterparts, and that a strong loyalist base might assist the British in making inroads. What is so important to understand here is that with the French entering the war, it really did change everything. Sure, the war is known as the American War of Independence. However, once it became clear that the French were going to get involved, North America became a secondary theater. There had been conversations at the end of May 1778 between Amherst, North, and the King about just abandoning North America altogether in order to deal exclusively with the new French threat. The British ultimately decided against a full pullout, hoping that by having Clinton hold New York, it would strengthen their position in future negotiations with the Americans. As we had discussed last time, the Carlisle Commission, that British delegation sent to negotiate, was prepared to offer the Americans home rule, independence in all but name. The British focus shifted towards the West Indies. Those islands had, historically, been more profitable than the North American colonies. Their capture would be a major blow to French power and prestige, not to mention economically. With the abandonment of Philadelphia, the Americans were able to retake their capital. They all knew that they needed to get back to business, because there were pressing issues for them to consider. One of the primary selling points of the Declaration of Independence had been that doing so would open up the door to re-establish an official government. However, as we stand here some 2 years after the Declaration was made, the young United States struggled to complete that end. The problem was that the development of the Articles of Confederation were proving to be a frustratingly long and drawn-out process. All of this discussion of a greater union between the colonies, and now states, should not be taken to say that major differences did not still exist. The Articles, based on the framework of Franklin's Albany Charter, were drafted by a committee made up of one delegate from each state, with the primary job of drafting falling to John Dickinson. On July 12, 1776, Dickinson and company would present their proposals to Congress. Immediate clashes took place, and quickly the states balked over the question of representation, and whether it should be based on population or if it should be an equal vote per state. Unsurprisingly, the large states felt quite differently than the small states on this matter. These problems would prove difficult for the states to overcome, and quickly, with the war taking up so much congressional energy, the Articles became something of a secondary matter. By November 15, 1777, however, well over a year after the first draft was presented, Congress ratified the Articles. On the question of representation, it was the small states that won out, divorcing the vote from the populace of the individual states. Among the biggest changes to the Articles was a provision that Congress shall only have the powers that were expressly delegated to them, and confirming that the states are, in all other matters, sovereign. When we discuss the 1787 Constitutional Convention next season, we are going to spend a whole lot of time on this particular provision, as it would render the central government ineffective to the point of impotence. Further questions would be raised over land claims that, even at this late point, were often ridiculous in scope. I have in the past talked about those colonies that claimed land stretching all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. It has, admittedly, been a while since I have brought this up. However, rest assured that such claims were still a thing. Those states that had defined western boundaries balked at the absurd land claims and argued that such lands should be given to Congress as a method to begin paying the rapidly growing national debt that the United States was racking up. For those states, however, that had dreams of California, they were probably far less eager to give up their expansive claims. To combat this problem, they instead inserted a line into the Articles that said no state shall be deprived of land for the benefit of the United States. This language codified these large claims, while likewise making passage that much more difficult. Those states without huge amounts of western lands were not wild about giving their neighbors such power and holdings. For the enslaved peoples and the Indians, things proved to be even more dire. With respect to the slaves, a provision was inserted stating that should a slave owner take his slave with him into another state, that their property was safe from seizure. In other words, if a state should do something like, say, abolish slavery, a slave owner would be able to recover their slave, even if they made it into a state that had abolished slavery. American attitudes towards the Native Americans was likewise at a low point. Following the American victory at Saratoga, the Americans did not waste the opportunity to rub it in the faces of the Iroquois. As historian Robert Parkinson puts it, American promises to the Indians came with threats, belittling, haranguing language, whereas the British continued to provide gifts. Dickinson had attempted to put protections into the Articles of Confederation for the protection of the Indians. However, it would not survive to the product presented to Congress in November 1777. Those living along the frontiers were certainly not in favor of Indian protection. Furthermore, the attitudes during 1777 towards the Indians had slipped even further, following Burgoyne's boasting the previous summer, and then even more following the J. McCree incident. The native tribes would continue to cause frustration for an American people who had to grapple with how to interact with them independently of the British. At one point during 1778, there was an offer of potential statehood made to the Delaware, something that would have provided them integration into the new nation. However, this idea died a silent death, buried in a committee that likely had little interest in such a plan. With the approval of the Articles of Confederation coming in November 1777, the Congress met at York, Pennsylvania. A document that had already struggled to obtain congressional approval now faced a far more substantial challenge. In order for the new government to take effect, it was going to need the unanimous approval from all of the states, something which seemed unlikely, if not outright impossible. As it would turn out, the delegates were right to worry, as by the spring of 1778, only 8 of the 13 states had agreed to ratify the Articles. It would take several more years before the Articles would finally be ratified and put into effect. Next time, we are going to spend our episode looking at the state of politics inside the United States in 1778 through an investigation into the Carlisle Commission. Until next time, I hope you all have a wonderful 2 weeks. I hope that you are staying healthy and that you are staying safe. And I will see you back here next time as we dig deeper into the Carlisle Commission.